In 2025, the American government made the biggest shift in trade policy in the last 100 years. 4 promises were made. Foreigners would foot the bill, jobs would come back, the trade deficit would fall, and the Treasury would collect trillions. GDP grew 2.2%. The stock market remains near all-time highs. From the outside, it looks like nothing happened. Except when the 2025 data came in, it told a different story. There's a kind of economic damage that doesn't show up on the evening news, but that does show up on the grocery bill, the car payment, and the letter from the bank saying the mortgage wasn't approved. It isn't collapse, it's erosion. Permanent, invisible, and distributed in a way where those who have the least pay proportionally the most. The poorest households lost 3 times more relative income than the wealthiest. And the mechanism that produced this wasn't an accident. It was the predictable consequence of 4 promises that didn't survive contact with the data. If you think tariffs are a dispute between governments and that the American consumer was kept out of it, the numbers we're going to look at today will change that perception. Do the 4 promises actually hold up when confronted with the data? Who is footing the bill, and in what proportion? And what does this process mean for anyone trying to buy a home, keep a business running, or find a job in the years ahead? In 2025, the American government made a bet. Not a small one, not a cautious one. It was the biggest reversal in American trade policy in nearly 100 years. And it came with 4 promises that, at the time, seemed hard to argue against. The first was about money. Tariffs would pour trillions into the American Treasury, enough to reduce the deficit and fund the government without tightening the belt of ordinary citizens. The Congressional Budget Office itself projected $3 trillion in revenue over a decade if the IEEPA tariffs held. $3 trillion. It was a fiscal promise of historic scale. The second was about jobs. With imported goods more expensive, Americans would buy American products. Factories that had shut down would reopen. Workers from the Rust Belt, those regions that watched their jobs migrate overseas for decades, would return to the production line. It was a promise of dignity for everyone who had been left behind by globalization. The third was about balance. The American trade deficit was presented as an open wound, proof that other countries were winning in their trade with Americans. Tariffs would be the remedy: fewer imports, more domestic production, a more balanced trade sheet. The logic seemed straightforward. The fourth was about power. Tariffs as a diplomatic weapon, to pressure China, close better deals, force allies to contribute more to their own defense, and stem the flow of fentanyl across the borders. A geopolitical lever disguised as trade policy. And to be fair, each of these promises had some historical precedent. Tariffs have protected emerging industries before. They have worked as negotiating leverage before. The problem was not in the individual logic of each piece. It was in trying to fit all of them together at the same time, with the same tool, in an economy that had changed dramatically since those strategies last worked. Because when the 2025 data arrived, and when it did, the story it told was not the one the government had promised. According to the Budget Lab at Yale, the tariffs in effect through February 2026 represent an average loss of $800 per American household. For the poorest families, the loss is $400, smaller in absolute terms, but 3 times larger as a share of disposable income than for the wealthiest 10%. Someone is paying the bill. And when the data shows who that someone is, the 4 promises start to collapse, one by one. The most repeated promise of all was simple. The tariffs would be paid by the Chinese, the Europeans, the Mexicans. Foreign producers would have to lower their prices to keep selling in the American market. The American consumer would pay nothing. It was a politically powerful narrative, and a factually wrong one. A study by the European Central Bank published in March 2026 analyzed exactly this. The conclusion was direct. Foreign exporters absorb only a small fraction of tariff costs. The bulk of the bill falls on American importers and consumers. In the short run, the American consumer already bears about 1/3 of the total tariff cost. In the long run, when American companies exhaust their ability to absorb costs by compressing margins, that share could exceed half. The Budget Lab at Yale measured the pass-through of tariffs directly to consumer prices. For imported consumer goods, the pass-through ranged between 40% and 76%. For durable goods, cars, appliances, electronics, the pass-through exceeded 100% under some methodologies. That means prices rose by more than the tariff itself. In practice, the numbers confirm what theory predicted. Prices of imported durable goods rose 1.4% during 2025, compared to a decline of 2.2% over the same period in 2023. Imported essential consumer goods rose 1.3%, compared to 0% in the prior period. There's no sign that foreign producers are subsidizing the American consumer. The signal points in the opposite direction. And there's one detail that makes the picture worse. Economic theory says tariffs should strengthen the dollar, making imports cheaper in local currency terms and offsetting part of the cost to consumers. What actually happened was the reverse. The dollar weakened 6.3% against its December 2024 average. Imports became even more expensive, not cheaper. Think of it this way. It is like installing a toll booth on a highway expecting the truck drivers to foot the bill, only to find out they simply add the cost to the price of whatever they are delivering. The toll exists, the revenue exists, but the one who pays is the person buying at the other end. The first promise did not survive contact with the data, and the second one was heading down the same road. This was by far the most emotionally charged promise. The image of the American industrial worker, who spent decades watching his profession get outsourced, his factory close, his city hollow out, returning to the production line. It was the promise that the clock could be turned back. The data turns in a different direction. Total employment in the U.S. grew by only 400,000 jobs in the year ending January 2026, compared to 1.2 million in the same period the year before. There are other factors at play, including the sharp drop in net immigration, from 2.4 million in 2024 to 321,000 in 2026. But tariffs have their own contribution, and it does not point where the promise said it would. The Budget Lab calculated the long-run impact of tariffs sector by sector. The result reveals a contradiction built into the very logic of the policy. Manufacturing expands 1.2%, the stated goal, but construction contracts 2.4%, and agriculture declines more than 1%. The gain in manufacturing is more than wiped out by losses in other sectors. The mechanism is simple to understand but hard to fix. Tariffs protect whoever produces the taxed good, but they raise input costs for every other sector that depends on steel, aluminum, electronic components, and imported raw materials. Now, auto plant might benefit from tariffs on foreign cars, and at the same time pay more for the steel it uses in production. The net result depends on which effect is larger. In 2025, the negative effect on sectors dependent on imported inputs outweighed the positive effect on protected manufacturing. And there is one figure that captures it all. The Manufacturing Industrial Production Index rose 2.1% during 2025. But employment in the sectors most exposed to tariffs came in 0.8% below the pre-2025 trend. Production went up. Jobs did not come back in proportion. What that suggests is that wherever expansion happened, it happened through automation, not mass hiring. The factories may have reopened, but the jobs that Rust Belt workers were waiting for were not there. The American trade deficit was presented as proof that the U.S. was losing, that other countries were taking advantage of the American market. The solution, in the official narrative, was obvious: make imports more expensive and the deficit would fall. The logic had appeal, but it had a fundamental flaw. It ignored how trade deficits actually work. Trade deficits are not determined by tariffs. They are determined by the gap between what a country saves and what it invests. A country that invests more than it saves, like the U.S., will necessarily import more than it exports, regardless of how large the tariff wall is. That is the structural mechanism that tariffs simply cannot change. If the American fiscal deficit keeps growing and private savings stay low, the country needs foreign capital to finance that excess demand, and that foreign capital arrives in the form of imports. Changing the tariffs does not change that fundamental equation. The 2025 data confirms this in practice. Despite the highest tariff barrier since the 1930s, the American trade deficit did not shrink in any structural way. Imports plunged between April and December, but that was preceded by NA aggressive stockpiling at the start of the year when companies rushed to buy goods before tariffs kicked in. The deficit fluctuated. It did not fall. Think of it this way. It is like trying to drain a bathtub by plugging one drain while two others are still open. The fiscal deficit and low American savings keep pouring in. Blocking imports redistributes where the water comes from. It does not lower the level of the tub. The third promise did not survive the math. And the fourth, the most sophisticated of all, contained a contradiction that the government itself took a long time to acknowledge. This is the hardest argument to take apart, because the contradiction is not in the premise. It is in the impossible combination of objectives. The government promised two things at the same time. Tariffs would generate trillions in revenue for the Treasury, and tariffs would bring production back to the U.S., reducing imports. The problem is that those two goals destroy each other. Tariffs generate revenue because imports keep flowing. If imports fall, because production shifted to American soil or because trade contracted, the revenue disappears with them. You cannot have both. It is a contradiction built into the heart of the policy. The number that makes it concrete. The Congressional Budget Office projected up to $3 trillion in revenue from the IEEPA tariffs over a decade. When the U.S. Supreme Court struck those tariffs down on February 20, 2026, the Budget Lab at Yale recalculated the projection: $1 trillion, less than one-third. And even that number depends on the remaining tariffs surviving further legal challenges, which is far from guaranteed. The Supreme Court ruling opened another hole. The Penn-Wharton budget model projects refunds of up to $175 billion, amounts that importers are entitled to claim for tariffs paid under a law the court ruled unconstitutional. J.P. Morgan estimates that $130 billion in tariffs collected in 2025 may need to be returned. The legal process is still undefined. The gap is not. The GDP impact summarizes everything in a single number. The remaining tariffs will leave the American economy persistently 0.1% smaller in the long run, the equivalent of $30 billion annually. It sounds small, but it is permanent, and it compounds over decades. And the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, after analyzing 40 years of historical data from advanced economies, reached a conclusion that contradicts, point by point, what the official narrative had promised. In the short run, tariffs act as a brake on demand. Unemployment rises and inflation falls. In the long run, unemployment returns to normal, but inflation rises and stays elevated for up to 3 years. The sequence is systematically the inverse of what was promised. 4 promises, 4 collapses, documented, measured, and published by institutions with no political interest in distorting the outcome. What does that mean for the question in the title? The American economy is breaking, just not the way you expected to see it. There's no market crash, no unemployment lines stretching out the door. GDP grew 2.2% in 2026. The stock market is still near all-time highs. From the outside, it looks like nothing happened. And that is precisely what makes what is happening even more dangerous. Because the damage tariffs produced is not sudden, it is permanent. It is the kind of damage that does not make the evening news, but shows up in the grocery bill, in the car payment, in the letter from the bank saying the mortgage was not approved. The American mortgage rate is not expected to fall below 5.8% before 2030. An entire generation will come of age without being able to buy a home, not because the economy exploded, but because it was made gradually more expensive, more inaccessible, more unequal. And the mechanism does not stop. When tariffs shift from 10% to 25%, then get suspended, then reinstated, then struck down by the Supreme Court, then reimposed under a different law, then investigated all over again, no company can plan 2 years ahead. A company that cannot plan does not hire. An economy that does not hire does not grow. 8 out of 10 small American business owners raised prices or considered doing so because of the tariffs. Nearly half delayed expansion plans. 1 in 3 already anticipated layoffs. This is not an acute crisis. It is chronic erosion. And chronic erosion does not generate headlines. It generates a generation that earns less, pays more, and understands less and less why. What to watch from here? The inflation level on durable goods over the next few quarters, because the tariff pass-through is not finished yet. The unemployment rate through the end of 2026, which is projected to rise by at least 0.3 percentage points from the remaining tariffs alone. And the value of the dollar, which has already weakened 6.3% since December 2024, making everything imported even more expensive than the tariffs alone were already making it. The question in the title is not whether tariffs will knock the American economy down in a single blow. The right question is a different one. How many quiet, permanent, invisible hits can an economy absorb before waking up unrecognizable? The data suggests that process has already begun, and that no one in power has a clear plan to reverse it.